WFLA.com.
Hi, and welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Great to have you with us. Rush Limbaugh, the EIB Network, the Limbaugh Institute for Advanced Conservative Studies. And we are happy, as we always have been, to welcome back to the program President George W. Bush. Mr. Bush, welcome back, and thank you for giving us some time today, sir.
Rush, thank you. I'm honored to be giving this, to talking to you about this new book I just released.
How many times a day in the last 2 years have you heard people tell you they miss you?
Well, every time they do, I'm flattered, and I appreciate it very much. There's a big billboard between Dallas and Waco that says that, and it makes a guy feel good, and I appreciate. I signed books today in Dallas, and quite a few people went by and said that, and it's a very kind thing for people to say.
Well, I'm sure they mean it. Now, what's your take on the election? This is historic. Republicans have not won this many seats in the House, I think, since the 1930s. This election goes deep. State legislatures, governorships. This was big. What's your take?
Well, you might remember I was president during 2 off-year elections. In 2002, we picked up seats. In 2006, we lost seats. So I'm familiar with both ends of off-year elections. And in 2006, people were disgruntled. And, you know, in the book, I point out that people were kind of tired of me. The Iraq War wasn't looking good in the fall of 2006. But people are also tired of sex scandals and bridges to nowhere and the failure to reform Social Security, for example. And they showed up and said, wait a minute, we're unsatisfied. And that's what happened again here. It was a big election, and people asked me about it. And I'm not going to try to dissect all the election, but I do appreciate the fact that democracy functions, and when people are frustrated, they show up, and in this case, they had a huge influence.
Now, what's it like? I mean, you just said people were tired of you in 2006. What's it like to sit in the Oval Office or wherever you happen to be as president and believe that people are tired of you? And do you want to do anything about that?
Well, in my case, I wasn't going to compromise principle, nor was I going to abandon the mission in Iraq. And so in the fall of 2006, as these elections were approaching, I was in the process of deciding to put more troops into Iraq. And, sometimes if you're president and people are tired of you just have to soldier on. I was convinced we could succeed in Iraq, and I knew failure in Iraq would be catastrophic, and success could be transformative. And so, on this particular issue, I said I'm going to do what I think is right, and I spent quite a bit of time in the book writing about that.
We noted at the time that there were some vicious attacks against your Iraq policy, against you personally, and you never responded in kind in a political sense to what were political attacks. And I in my lifetime, I don't recall a political party ever opposing their own country at war, seeking a defeat, as the Democrats seemed. I mean, Harry Reid was out there, Mr. President. This war is lost.
Yes, that I chronicled that moment, and I didn't like it then. I don't like hearing it now, because as a leader in the Senate, I felt it was an irresponsible act, irresponsible statement to say to a mother or a loved one, your child or your loved one is headed into a losing situation. You can disagree with the policy, disagree with whether we should, work to establish democracy in Iraq after we liberated it, but to condemn soldiers heading into mission to a lost cause is just, it was inexcusable as far as I was concerned.
Why didn't you do more about it? Why didn't you comment more about it at the time? I mean, I asked you once, and you said that you didn't want to sully the office of the presidency by descending to base political level. But I mean, this was not something base politics. This was keeping the country safe.
Well, I understand that, but on the other hand, I do believe in the institution of the presidency, and I didn't think it was right then. I still don't think it's right to engage in name calling if you're the president of the United States. And I was focused on the mission, as were the troops, and because of their bravery and sacrifice, the situation turned around shortly after that statement. I've been I've discussed this with other people in my administration. When they call me a liar, should I have called them names? And my attitude is, it was no then, obviously, and I still feel very strongly that's the way a president ought to conduct himself.
Well, now, some of the people in your administration, Karl Rove, have said in hindsight that they think, maybe Karl speaking for himself, certainly other people in the administration should have done more to defend you and the administration against these attacks, because these attacks against you are attacks against your voters, attacks against the American people who support the United States at war.
That's right. No, Karl feels that way. I read his book and recommend it. He'll be happy for me to hear. And, yeah, I mean, Karl felt like we should have punched back harder. I can't remember if he was referring to I should have punched back harder or we should have punched back harder. I wasn't going to punch back because, again, I think the office of the presidency is precious. It's an institution that needs to be strengthened. And getting into a verbal mud fight with people, just in my judgment, demeans the office. And so I chose not to do that.
Okay, demeans the office. It hasn't stopped. By this definition, the office is being demeaned today. I mean, you are being blamed for the economy today. The current occupant constantly runs around saying, I inherited this mess from you. Did you ever say you inherited a terrorism crisis from President Clinton or an economic bubble?
To do that. Each president has his own tactics. And I've been around politics long enough to know how it works. And so I've chosen not to engage this way. And during my presidency or in my post-presidency. Look, I like not being in the news. It's a little ironic since I'm talking to one of the most widely listened people in America, the most widely listened person in America. But I'm very comfortable being submerged, as I say, and I'm emerging because I want people to read this book, frankly, and I think it'll give people an interesting perspective about what it was like to be president and how you make decisions in a complex environment. And, once this book is finished, I'm going back to as normal a life as possible, promoting freedom and marketplace and accountability in schools and playing golf with people like you.
Anytime.
Thank you. I hear your game's getting better now that you've gotten married.
Yeah, because I've got less time to play, and the less time I play, the better I seem to get. Now, look, one thing about the predecessor and so forth. I mean, you were president of the United States. You were the leader of the country. You were elected twice by the people of this country on substantive issues. Now we find ourselves in a really challenging economic time, and it is being said that you drove the economy in the ditch. You were behind the wheel in the car. Now, Mr. President, the people, we can't relate to being president. We can only try to understand it. And what we do, if we hear ourselves being blamed for things that we had nothing to do with, our tendency would be to respond to it, to try to correct the record. But in your book, you steer clear.
Well, on this issue, I don't steer clear because I remind the reader that on the issue of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, I saw a problem and went to Congress and said, look, this is a group of this is an enterprises that have got an implicit government guarantee, and they're taking risky stances. And therefore, we ought to regulate them. If they've got a government implicit guarantee, there ought to be some sense of regulation to make sure they don't misuse that guarantee. And I make it clear in the book what happened, and that is that powerful forces in Congress resisted that reform. If those reforms had taken place in 2003, it's hard to predict whether or not this crisis would have occurred. But I'm comfortable and telling the reader, and comfortable that history will judge, that we try to do something about it. And, and eventually the truth wins out. And this book's an attempt to, set the record straight from my perspective.
Is that your faith speaking, that the truth will out?
Do I think that? Yeah, I do. Look, I remember when Ronald Reagan left office. Frankly, you're old enough to remember when Ronald Reagan left office.
Yeah, I am.
And, dunce, warmonger, all the names he was being called, and at the time of his burial, he was being viewed as a superb president, and rightly so.
If you had it to do over, you were talking about Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac. If you had it to do over, would you do the TARP bailout?
I would have. Because
what were you told about that? What did they tell you that made it?
We were headed for a second depression. Or, they didn't say quite that. It was a little more nuanced than that. But if you don't do something big, we could see a second depression or depression bigger than the second depression. And if you're the president, you don't have time to gamble. And I didn't like using taxpayers' money to bail out the people that got us in trouble. I didn't like it at all. But but when you're president, you get faced with stark choices, and I couldn't have lived with myself had the country gone into a deep depression, and people's lives would have been affected, and people thrown out of work. And there's a lot of people not in work today, and all of us, are concerned about that. But the situation could have been a lot worse.
Well, you talk about the people that got us into trouble. Some people think it wasn't Wall Street by themselves. Some people think it was the Democrat Party. You talk about Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac and the whole subprime mortgage mess. I mean, that was a brainchild of Democrats.
Yeah, that's right.
But this is we bailed the Democrats out of a problem too, and they continue to this day to blame you and the Republicans for it. Although I don't think they're getting away with it any longer. The election returns, I think, signal that. We're talking with former President Bush. We have to take a brief time out. His new book, Decision Points, published today. Back with more right